conjures up different meanings to different people. To the Pilgrims of New England, it had a specific meaning as personified in this majestic monument erected in their honor in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Why do you suppose the central figure of this breathtaking monument is a 36-foot image called Faith?
It's because faith was a central tenet in the thinking of those sojourners in this strange land. No matter what their fate, their focus was fixed on the one who had called them to the new world. Hello, I'm Stephen Hopkins. I was one of the strangers that traveled on board the Mayflower with the saints from Leiden in 1620. I'd like to give you a personal invitation to join us for an informative evening at our annual Fall History Seminar, where we will have a chance to explore the story, the real story of the Pilgrims. And if you're curious as to what this furry item may be, you'll need to come to the event to find out. See you there.
Good evening. My name is Jody Wolf, and it is my privilege to welcome each of you to the 26th Annual Fall History Seminar. Let's begin our proceedings in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we marvel at your working in the affairs of mankind. We're grateful that we can be a part of such a wonderful place as the United States of America, and that we can be a part of this place here at Pensacola Christian College, where your workings throughout the affairs of mankind are exalted. We thank you for one of your servants, Dr. John Reese, and for his desire to communicate your workings to the students and the faculty and the staff that are here. We thank you for the burden that you placed on his heart, and we ask now that you would be exalted in this time together this evening. For we ask and we pray these things in the name of our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Tonight's program is made possible through the efforts of many friends and colleagues. It would be difficult to mention each by name, but Dr. Reese did ask me to give a collective thank you to all the faculty and staff who have given so freely of their time and of their skill to make this presentation possible. Your service has not gone unnoticed. A special thanks, however, is due to Leo and Nancy Martin of Plymouth, Massachusetts, Paul and Kathy Reese of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and Jim and Jan Porter of Molina, Florida, for their selfless contributions. The year 2020 marks the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims' landing in America. So it is altogether appropriate that we take time to examine the events which contributed to this compelling narrative. A narrative which until recently, or I should say which has recently come under assault by those who are intent on removing our nation's landmarks. The objective of tonight's presentation is to portray as accurately as is possible an overview of the times, the people, the events which blended together to form this unique saga, a genuine portrait of God's providence at work in the affairs of mankind. Our presenter this evening is Dr. John Reese, a member of the PCC history faculty. Dr. Reese has a personal connection with the Pilgrim story in that both sides of his family were represented on the Mayflower. On his mother's side was an indentured servant named Edward Doughty who served another passenger, Stephen Hopkins, who, according to family accounts, was a direct forebearer of this evening's presenter, Dr. John Stephen Reese. Accordingly, tonight's historical monodrama will feature Dr. Reese role-playing his own relative, Stephen Hopkins, an ordinary man who found himself involved in numerous extraordinary adventures throughout his life. As we join Stephen Hopkins tonight, he's musing about the monumental events which transpired in and around 1620. In an interesting technological twist of technological creativity, which Mr. Hopkins does not understand, he will address the modern questions and misconceptions which abound concerning the Pilgrim story as the narrative unfolds. So would you join me now in welcoming Stephen Hopkins at this time?
Well, good evening and welcome out on a stormy night. It seems that my life was defined by storms, and so that you would take the courage and the tenacity to show up means much to me. I'd like to begin our story tonight when the seas were calm. This is actually Cape Cod, but the waves were not quite like that the night I'm thinking of. It was December 11, 1620. We'd made our way around the southern portion of Cape Cod, only to find ourselves in the midst of this tremendous storm that had sprung up suddenly. I mean, the winds and the waves were blowing. The weather was so cold that the water was forming ice sheets on our coats. But nonetheless, we made our way along, and then the worst of it happened. The rudder broke, the mast snapped, and it looked like we'd come all the way across the ocean only to be lost right here in the Cape. And then we could see it in the night ahead, an island. But the rocky shoals were such that there was no way our little shallop could survive that. Oh, by the way, my name is Stephen Hopkins, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself as we get started here. Actually, I need to correct an error that I've heard told, and that is that I was born in Gloucestershire and that I was brought up in that area. No, I was brought up in Hampshire. I'm not sure how that story got out there, but I wanted to correct the record before we go any further. I was actually baptized in this church in 1581, and just a few days later, another young baby, they're usually young when they're born, aren't they? Another baby was baptized by the name of William Palmer. Ironically, William Palmer would end up living in my house in Plymouth Plantation 40 years later. The ways of God. Well, I grew up in that area, married, and had a couple of children, but things were not going my way financially. The lease was running out on the house, and so really in an act of desperation to try to get some land, I signed on as an indentured servant to Jamestown in 1609. I'd heard some of the horror stories of the goings-on, but hey, this was my chance to get some land in the New World, so off I sailed in a 3-ship flotilla. Now, we stayed north of the regular pathway because of the Spanish and the threat of them, but in the process, we sailed right into a hurricane. I tell you, storms are what made my life. And it was so bad that within hours of the start of that hurricane, about 10,000 pounds of our hardtack was underwater inside the ship. We were called to duty to bail water 1 hour at a time and then an hour off. We did that for the duration until we saw land coming ahead. It was Bermuda. We managed to shipwreck on Bermuda, and there the captain in charge determined he should rebuild the ships. 6 months later, we're still in Bermuda. My contract was with Jamestown. And I'll be candid with you here. I started a little bit of mutinous discussion. I mean, after all, my contract was not in Bermuda. Why should this person be in charge of my life? Well, I got thrown into the hoosegow. I was brought to trial and sentenced to die. But I pled on behalf of my wife and children. What would those poor souls do without me? And they gave me clemency instead. Not such good fortune befell the other fella who had led a similar move there. Well, we got to Jamestown, and we got there in 1609, not long after Captain John Smith had left. Of course, you know the name Captain Smith, don't you? Incredibly used by God at just the precise time. Well, I arrived there just after he had left, and things were not going well at all. So poorly, in fact, that we were just desperate to find something to eat. We'd left Bermuda where there were wild pigs and fruit and all kinds of succulent food. We arrived here to a starving place. Things were so bad, in fact, we actually got on board of a ship. Do you know this story? We got on board a little shallop that was there, and we set sail down the James River, and for a space of several hours, Jamestown was actually unoccupied. The first permanent English settlement had been abandoned. And just then, a resupply ship showed up and saved the day for Jamestown. Well, my experience there did not go well, and so I eventually made my way back to England, and that's where we want to pick up the story. From time to time, we're going to have these strange images pop up, and whenever that does, we're just going to pause wherever we are. I want some audience participation here, and so for this first round, I'm going to ask Pastor Wolf, where are you? Would you mind coming back up to the microphone, Pastor Wolf? Now, 2 more times, as time permits, that same screen will pop up. And when it does, if you want a turn to come on stage, wave your hand high and proud. I'll be looking for you. Okay, Pastor Wolf.
Yes, sir.
First of all, I find it rather interesting that someone with the name Wolf would be shepherd of the Lord's flock. But be that as it may, Pastor Wolf, do you use the Geneva Bible or do you use the King James Bible?
Well, we use the Geneva Bible. However, knowing that this new Bible has come out, it hasn't quite made it yet across to our pulpit. So we've heard a lot about it, and it's an authorized by the throne, so it must be good. And but we've been using the Geneva now for a number of years.
Now, you say you have a doctorate in theology?
I do, indeed.
You're talking as if you're from my time. I thought you lived way ahead of my time.
Well, I was trying to be considerate.
Oh, he's older than he looks. Okay.
I didn't want to show my age,
Well, we prefer the Geneva Bible where I'm from because the Geneva Bible has those extra notes in the margins that basically say even the king is under the guardianship of God. And if man's law goes contrary to God's law, whom should we obey? God. And I know that King James doesn't care for that too much. And that's one of the reasons why he promoted this King James Bible. I just had to test you on your religious theology a bit. But here's what I want you to do. You can pick any item that you see here from this point over. You can pick something there if you want. But anything you see that you would like to learn more about, and I'll be happy to try to explicate that to tell a little bit of the story. So take your time. I know the audience can't see too well. We've got several kinds of furs. We've got, there's a special implement up here. I'm not trying to draw hints. We got this thing right here.
Well, I see something shiny right here.
What do you see right there in the middle?
Well, I was going to point to let's do this right here.
Oh.
I'm interested in that.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. Why don't you have a seat? I'll be happy to talk about this. Do I look like a Viking? This is a cow's horn. How about that? Well, why would a cow's horn be on display here as we're talking about Plymouth Plantation, 1620? As you probably know, in those days, we used matchlock guns. And in order to prepare this gun to be fired, this is not in working order, so don't panic. If you need a safe space, we have some outside the auditorium here. But this cow's horn would then have the end clipped off of it, so a brass cap could be put on it, and a leather top, so that we could pour our powder. Have you ever heard the phrase, keep your powder dry? Or have you ever heard the phrase, going off half-cocked? Have you ever heard the phrase, a flash in the pan? All of those terms come from this weapon right here, a matchlock. Now, the flintlock has just been making its way in, but it's a more expensive gun, and so this is what most of us carried while we were at Plymouth. And you probably know from basic background that with a musket, basically what you have to do is drop the gunpowder in first and then push a musket ball down and all. But how do you make it fire? Well, there's a special device here, a pan, and you put a little bit of powder and you pull it right over to that open hole. Then when you pull this lever down here, or trigger, as it's sometimes called, it causes this device to spin down, and on this device is a piece of cord. That's why it is called a matchlock. And that match cord has to be lit, so it's burning slowly. And whenever that hot ember hits that pan, it sets off that gunpowder, which then burns through the hole and sets off your main charge. Now, there are a couple challenges associated here. If you don't have the bullet seated all the way down and there's an airspace, it could cause the barrel to blow up. There's also the challenge of your wick going out. In fact, Captain John Smith, I'll tell a quick story about him. He was actually fighting the Muslims over in the far eastern part of Europe, and one night he came up with an idea. He didn't have enough sentries for duty, so he just took a bunch of these match strings, and he lit them and set them along the edge of the forest. So anyone looking out from inside the fortress thought, oh, there's a whole line of sentries. All they were is burning matchsticks. Pretty clever. He also developed a method for lobbing grenades over the walls. Quite a character, that John Smith. But I divert. Oh, by the way, for all of your effort in coming, I want to give you some seeds here. Can you catch? Okay, these are some sort of lentils or something. Reese's Pieces. I'm not sure what that's about, but congratulations. That's for coming up here. All right, we need to continue our commentary. As I was saying, the story begins in England with the Reformation. This whole movement of religious dissent and those that are going to speak out on behalf of conscience issues. Let's see if we can get it started here by moving forward and looking briefly at the history of religious dissent. The first step, of course, is the beginnings of the English Reformation. You know that story, don't you? The 1630s. Henry VIII broke from the church, not because he had some religious compelling reason, but strictly for political purposes. He wanted a male heir to the throne. But God used that set of sequences, and so in a period of time, his daughter then, Elizabeth, came to the throne, and she introduced a more formal reformation of sorts. The Book of Common Prayer, and really shifting away from the Catholic Church. By the time we get to the late 1500s, though, there were those within the Church of England who felt like the church still smelled of popery. You know, there was too many things that reminded them of the Catholic Church, bowing before the altar, wearing the vestments, crossing themselves. And so the Puritans simply wanted to purify the church, but they didn't have the courage to break with the church. And then in the 1580s, along came a Robert Brown, and he's often referred to as the founder of the Brownist movement. And he was the one that basically severed relations between the church and his individual church. Now, I think he's given more credit than is due him. He did not actually say, we're going back to the New Testament model, and he did not do away with hierarchy. He simply wanted to separate his congregation from the mainstream Anglican church. The group that really got the attention, and by the way, I am not one of these, and so I'm speaking as a Puritan toward this group called the Separatists. And by 1604, they had taken their stance, as it were. The Separatists is where we need to begin. Now, the story actually also has the year 1604 connection when someone lit off the dynamite, so to speak. It was a guy by the name of Guy Fawkes who decided he was going to blow up King James just as he came into the House of Lords to give a speech. He managed to dig a tunnel in underneath of the House of the Lords from a house next door down in the cellar. He brought in 30 barrels of gunpowder. And what's going to happen when that fire gets inside of those barrels? Well, it's not going to be a pretty sight. But someone squealed on him. Someone tipped off the authorities. And before that tragic event transpired, this fellow was exposed. He was executed, as I recall, over a period of 3 days. As it turns out, though, any dissident now was fair game. And one of the groups that was hardest hit were the Separatists. Of course, it was the Catholics who had sponsored that conspiracy, but now all dissent is going to be crushed. All dissent is going to be put down. And that's where the Separatists really find themselves in a hard way. One historian, I don't recognize him by name, made this observation. The Scrooby Church, and I want to come back and talk about the Scrooby Church specifically, was a remnant in the 17th century that was willing to pay the price, watch this now, of practicing holy Christian self-government in a day when the trend was to be dependent upon centralized government. There's a powerful lot in that statement. Pause and digest that for a bit. Here was a group that had the courage to stand up when the trend was to go toward, we'll just let the government take care of us. We'll let the government be in charge. They had the courage, the tenacity, just a little remnant, to stand up. Of course, they paid a tremendous price, but out of that came a statement by a historian I've heard of by name. Someone was telling me about some of the writers since my day and time, and he makes this observation: the Pilgrims were the spiritual ancestors of all Americans. I concur. There are some, I'm told, who would wish to rewrite the account and have us to believe that the Pilgrims were out there to maraud and destroy just like anyone else. They took advantage of the Indians. They mistreated them. And they're no different than, they hid under a religious guise, you see, but they were full of greed just like everyone else. As an outsider looking in, I'm not one of those separatists, so-called. I did not see that lived out day to day at all. The man who really is more responsible than any single person for the story that we're looking at tonight is this Pastor John Robinson. I would say this about Pastor Robinson: he had more influence on the founding of the Plymouth Plantation and all that has come of that since, Massachusetts Bay Colony, and I have a sense that there's going to continue to be growth moving forward. But this man had more influence on that whole movement than anyone else who never came to America. Pastor John Robinson was born into a conservative background. He went to Cambridge. At the time, Oxford and Cambridge were the two leading institutions, and he fell under the preaching of a strong Puritan professor, and he really bought into the Puritan movement. And that was all fine and good. He taught for 7 years, and then he went off to become pastor. But after this Guy Fawkes thing in 1604, the archbishop in his area really tightened the screws. And if you're going to be a pastor in one of these Anglican churches, you must subscribe to these common rules. Well, he could not, because his conscience told him that God is the one that's over the church, not the state. And so he resigned his position. And when he did, he ended up going to Scrooby and meeting up with those folks there. He actually wrote a 3-volume series, and this is worth the price of tonight's talk alone, just to take a look at these, because he shares his heart, and it's genuinely founded on scriptural principles. In his parting words to the Pilgrims, he was not able to go with them. They made the decision, whichever the majority was, those who stayed in Leiden in the Netherlands or those who went to the New World, he would go with that group. He really wanted to go. He says as much in his writings, but because the majority stayed, he was obliged to stay. And then 5 years later, he contracted a plague and died at age 50. His work was finished. But he wrote this. He charged us before God and his blessed angels to follow him no farther than he followed Christ. And if God should reveal anything to us by any other instrument than his, be as ready to receive it as ever we were to receive any truth by his ministry. For he was very confident the Lord had more truth and light yet to break forth out of his holy word. He was a humble man. When he was when he came in as co-pastor, he actually insisted that he be voted in as pastor. Pastor Robinson, perhaps more than any other pastor I know of, really promulgated this idea of local autonomy for the church. And he said, I'm simply following the New Testament. That's what the New Testament called for. There's no hierarchy talked of there, and so why should we follow it here? So the man that doesn't get much recognition, Pastor John Robinson, he never set foot in the New World, had a stupendous influence nonetheless. Some have called him the founding shepherd of America. These are descriptions of his work by this same historian I referred to earlier. The astute reader will be able to discern that the Pilgrim's selfless pastor who served them, that's Pastor Robinson, behind the scenes in England and the Netherlands, watch this now, inspired them to touch the heart of God, trained them to think the thoughts of God, and helped them to practice the government of God in their homes, churches, and civil compacts. Tremendous influence he had. And so this work leaves us a little bit of a sense of his tremendous impact. Well, the story continues. By 1607 or so, things were really getting tight. The Pilgrims, they call themselves the Separatists, so let's use that term here. The Separatists were now getting persecuted. They were being arrested. They were being thrown into jail. Scrooby was sort of the center of the operation, but Austerfield was another place, Gainsborough, and there were a number of these folks that had gathered to worship in that area, and they found refuge in William Brewster's estate. William Brewster was a well-heeled gentleman who had a sizable estate. He didn't own it. He actually leased it from the Sandys family. Some of you might recognize that name. The Sandys were the ones that helped with several of these adventures at any rate, and they were sympathetic for the most part to the Puritan cause. But at this point, William Brewster opened up his estate so that they could secretly meet in his place. And that went on for some time, but there came this point where they had to make a decision. We've got to leave. We cannot continue as we are here with all of the pressures on us. And so they set out to do that, and one of the masterminds was William Bradford. He had a hard upbringing, orphaned at age 7, gone through a lot of hardship by the time he was 18, but he fell in with the Separatist movement, was very much wooed by Pastor Smith and Pastor Robinson, and as one of the younger ones, he's going to have a tremendous influence too. And so the decision was finally made to make that move to the Netherlands. Now, I'm told that from time to time, these special images will pop up, and I'm supposed to answer whatever question shows up. What's that? I never heard that sound before, But whatever that was, did the Pilgrims refer to themselves as pilgrims? That's a good question. Did the Pilgrims call themselves pilgrims? Well, yes and no. Mostly no. They called themselves saints. And so I was a stranger on board the Mayflower. They were the saints. Now, that doesn't mean that we were pagans or that they viewed us as such, but those of us who were not a part of the Leiden congregation were referred to as strangers. We were the majority, actually, on board the Mayflower. They called themselves as saints, but they did understand that they were pilgrims passing through, as William Bradford wrote on one occasion. They knew there were pilgrims and looked not much on those things, but lifted their eyes to heaven, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. And so in that sense, yes, they were pilgrims. Well, the story continues. Here we are looking for a way out. They tried at least 3 times. In 1607, their efforts were foiled. Someone turned them over to the authorities. In 1608, just as the ship was loading the men, here came the authorities marching right down toward the seafront. And so the ship took off, just set out its sails and took off, leaving the women and children crying. They'd sold their homes. They'd gotten rid of all of their belongings, and here they are left haplessly on the shoreline. Their husbands had been kidnapped, more or less. Eventually, they were reunited, and so these were tough times. Finally, in 1608, they made their way over to Amsterdam. Now, they chose the Low Countries because there was religious freedom there. And so they were in Amsterdam from about 1608 to 1609. Things didn't go real well there because there was dissension within the church. Not from the Scrooby folks, but from others who had joined them. Arguments about communion and different parts of the church doctrine. And so at this point, Pastor Robinson wisely said, we need to just pull away. So they requested permission of the authorities to go to this little town some 30 miles further west, Leiden. And that's where they will live then from 1609 all the way through to 1620 when the first group set sail. Okay, so they're in Leiden. They were well respected. They were loved because they were hardworking. They were very conscientious. They were quiet Christians. They lost their livelihood in farming, so many of them took up weaving. They took up other trades. Brewster took up printing as a trade, for example. But as time went on, they saw that they were losing their children. Isn't that interesting? Here they were having relative success. It was hard. But they were making progress, and they had religious freedom, but they were concerned that their kids were going out and taking on the ways of the Dutch. They were joining the army. They were marrying the Dutch. They were taking on the language. They were losing their British association. And these Scrooby congregation members, they were loyal to the throne of Britain, and they were very discouraged by that. So really, it was the thought that they might lose their kids that caused them to make that next move. So they had made their first move here, but they actually called a meeting and determined whether or not they should leave the country. And one of the driving reasons why they made the decision to go was this. They saw that whatever banks the Dutch had against the inroads of the sea, the dikes, they had not sufficient ones against a flood of manifold profaneness. They held some of their children by the temptations of the place, were especially given in the licentious ways many young people drawn into dangerous extravagancies. They were losing their kids, so they were willing now to literally pull up stakes and go to a land that they'd never been to before. Kudos to them. They sent agents to London to try to arrange. The Dutch actually came to them and said, hey, we don't want to lose you. We'll relocate you to any part of the Low Countries you wish. We'll even finance your trip to New Guinea or to any place in South America. But they wanted to remain British citizens, and they politely turned that down. Instead, they were going to finance their own way. They knew it was going to be expensive. They would need help. So they sent a couple of representatives to London. In the meantime, they purchased their own ship, the Speedwell, which, as it turns out, didn't speed along very well at all. But be that as it may, they got things prepared. There were about 60 or so that wanted to go. They actually had a church meeting, and they prayed, they fasted. Who should go, who should stay back in the first round and all. And they prepared their way so that they could set sail. Pastor Robinson, once again, setting a wonderful example. He came on board the ship before they left. He preached a sermon. He knelt and prayed. They said that passerby folk were crying as they listened to this tremendous outpouring of emotion. And he prayed God's blessing on them. He wrote a letter to them to be read after they left. This man had a tremendous influence on the Separatists as they set sail. Well, they finally made their way from the wharf. The winds were prevailing. And they got to Southampton, where they rendezvoused with another ship. And this was the one that the Adventure Company had financed, namely the Mayflower. So we have a model of the Mayflower here, and it is a beautiful ship. This is about a 180-ton vessel. And basically, when we say 180 tons, it means that it can carry 180 barrels, sometimes called tons, those big, big barrels, right? And this ship was primarily a merchant ship used for carrying wine and other things back and forth. It was 100 feet from stem to stern, had 3 masts to it, and it had several parts underneath. And so this Mayflower, 3 times the size of the Speedwell, was going to be the primary means of conveying us across. My wife and I and family actually got on board this in July of that year. I'll tell more of that story as the storyline unfolds here. But as we get inside the ship, that's where I want to go for just a little bit and show you a little bit about what's happening here. There we go. She's sitting there in the water. You've got a couple of cannon down in the bottom. This is not a warship. Those are just to ward off would-be pirates, those that would try to steal your cargo. We've got castles fore and aft. There's our 3 masts and so on. It takes a crew of about 30 to operate this ship. Let's climb inside for just a moment to get a sense of what it looks like. The steerage area, the cabin for the captain, this is where the signing of the Mayflower Compact, as it's called now, took place. We did not call it that. The gun room. This is a shallop that's going to be used. I told you that story of the storm. That was the ship that cracked up on us right there. This is the gun deck, not designed for passengers, 5.5 feet tall, 20 feet wide, and 80 feet long. I'm told in the modern parlance that's like the size of a tennis court. And there were 102 of us crammed inside of that. You get an idea. The lower cargo bay is where they would keep the barrels and so forth. And I did mention the cannon. What's this? Reese's Pieces. Huh, that's interesting. Didn't you get some Reese's Pieces over there, Pastor Wolf? Are these candy? I'm trying to figure this out. Someone told me that they're related to me. It must be those eyes. I'm trying to figure it out myself. But anyway, this is inside the ship. This is where we would have signed that compact, 41 of us, before we stepped off ship. More on that as time permits. But imagine, now we were not as tall in our day as people are today, but 5.5 feet, you're still having to stoop and get along, and pretty miserable conditions. The capstan, which is where the anchor would be pulled up and so forth. So that's a look inside the ship for just a minute. Oh, here comes another question. Let's see what we have here. Did the Pilgrims bring any livestock on board the Mayflower? No, we really didn't. We didn't have room. No cattle, no big animals. We had 2 dogs, and I've even heard people question whether we brought chickens. I'll just say this much. When people were sick, we offered them chicken broth, so you figure that out for yourself. But we need to move on. So here we are at Southampton. Everyone's excited except one of the major leaders of the whole venture, Thomas Weston. He got cold feet. He had already upped the ante, and he was putting us into these straitjacket type rules that we'd have to work for so many years, and we'd get a certain percentage of the company joint stock and so on. And then he just up and said, forget it. I'm not even going to pay the fees to get you out of the wharf. So we had to sell a bunch of butter just to pay those fees. But nonetheless, the 2 ships set sail, and here we are headed to the Atlantic. And sure enough, the Speedwell developed major problems. Now, between you, me, and the split rail fence post here, it's possible the Dutch did this to us on purpose because they had a claim on that same area of the Hudson River where we were supposed to go, Northern Virginia, right there at the mouth of the Hudson River. I think they call it Manhattan or something like that nowadays. At any rate, the Indians that lived there are called the Manhattan Indians. I do know that. And so some say that they purposely put too much sail out, which caused the planks to torque, and that opened up cracks, and the seawater flowed in faster than we could pump it out. I was on the Mayflower, but I heard the horror stories. So we turned back to get repairs at Dartmouth and set sail again, this time 300 miles to sea. It's now late August. We were supposed to be gone a month and a half prior. And more problems, so we went back this time to Plymouth, and at that juncture, the decision was made to ditch the Speedwell. It was not speeding well at all. So now we had to pile into the Mayflower as best we could. A number were left behind. A lot of supplies were left behind. 102 of us managed to cram on board. And we set sail September 6th in the year 1620. And so here we are headed across the ocean. So far, so good. I mean, the winds were prevailing. We were making good progress until we hit storms. About 1,000 miles into the 3,000-mile-long journey, boy, did we hit storms. We were tossed, and a 180-ton vessel is like a cork on the water at that point. We're just being pitched every which way. The main beam that supports the deck cracked, but fortunately, by God's providence, according to William Bradford, we had a iron screw that we were able to put in place and get that fixed. The ship's carpenter did that. And then one of the guys in our crew, John Holland by name. Does anyone recognize the name John Holland? John Holland violated the rule to stay under deck. He was just tired of breathing all that stuffy air. It's like going through life breathing through a mask or something like that. And he said, I can't take it anymore. So he went on stage, and just at that point, a wave swept right across the deck, swept him off his feet right out into that frigid water. The average lifespan of a person in those frigid waters, probably 4 to 6 minutes. As he went overboard, he just happened to grab a rope that was trailing along in the water. He clung to that for life, and the sailors pulled him in hand over hand. God spared his life. It's an incredible story. In fact, his harrowing bath, as it were, resulted in something rather impressive here. I'm asked the question, I happen to have read this elsewhere, and that is that some 3 million people claim John Holland as their forebearer, including Winston Churchill, George Herbert, and George W. Bush. I don't know those names, but look at this providence of God. If he had not grabbed onto that rope and pulled back in, none of those people would have ever lived. God's stamp on this mission. Well, after 66 grueling days, we finally made it to land. And oh, what a blessing it was to be able to look out and to see land. But we were 250 miles off course. We soon discovered that. Because there were maps. Captain John Smith had sailed through this area, and he'd mapped much of this out. In fact, he was the one that gave the name Plymouth to that location, Captain John Smith. It was Gosnold who gave the name Martha's Vineyard to this location just south of. Well, our contract was to settle in Northern Virginia. We were out of bounds, and so that was November 9. We set sail the next day to try to make our way down along the coast, down toward Buzzards Bay. And boy, did we hit the shoals. I mean, the water, the shallows, we barely backed out of that thing. So the captain turned around and sailed right back up to the Cape. At which point, we had to make a decision. Do we try to go back down, or do we just settle with where we are? Well, the decision was made to stay where we are. This is the way a bird might see this land if they're flying overhead. If you see that big arching curve of land, that's the Cape Cod region, and right out there is Provincetown. That's where we're going to end up settling, landing our ship, I should say, for the first time and casting anchor there. So let's look at it this way. So we came in, we tried to make our way south. Things did not bode well for us, so we turned around and made our way north. Now, there were some of us that were a little concerned about this. I'd been in storms before, and here's another situation where we are outside the claim of our contract. And so I was proposing that, hey, when we get on land, I really don't have to listen to anybody. And so they needed to do something to rein in people like myself, to be candid with you. Here's another name that artifact. Do we happen to have anyone here from Virginia? I'm just curious. Oh, you mind coming down, sir? Come on down from Virginia. I spent those 3 years in Virginia, the most hated years of my life, and so I need to talk to someone from Virginia. Maybe you can change my attitude. Just come right around on this side. What's your first name, sir?
Joey Powell.
Joey. Come on over here, Joey, and good to meet you. I'm going to let you pick any item. We've already talked about the matchlock and the horn. So any other item you see there or up here that you would like to learn more about, so you just pick it up. Come on, Joey. Oh, he went for the big one. Okay, congratulations. You get some lentils. Don't eat them. Plant them. Okay, thank you. You can have a seat, Joey. Let's give Joey a hand there. Okay, we need to talk about a bear. All right. Now, there are actually not any bears right in and around Plymouth. You have to go a little bit further west to find them. But if you look at how the Indians were dressed, they would often wear leather leggings, then they would have bear skin wrapped around their middle. If you visit their homes, you would often see these kinds of bear skins on display. So they were very adept at hunting these creatures that you would not want to run into if you were working your way through the woods. I'm going to show you some pictures of those later on. But he chose the big one here, and he's a ferocious animal, that's for sure, the bear. But before we got off the ship, the determination was made to sign some sort of a compact. It was Pastor Robinson who wrote in his farewell letter to the folks. He said, now, you're probably going to have to put together some sort of a government. And he used the term that we see here, civil body politic. And so the leadership, William Brewster, the elder, William Bradford, John Carver, these were some of the movers and shakers among the Separatists there, got together and penned a document. This is what it looks like in handwriting. If you wanted to see what it looks like in print, there are actually 3 versions available, I'm told. The original's been lost. I'm saddened to hear that. But there are 3 versions. They all say pretty much the same thing. I can't help but observe here that it starts out, in the name of God, amen. There's the word God mentioned one time. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God. See, that statement indicates that the king gets his power from God. It's the grace of God that puts him in power. And so God is the originator of government, not government. Remember that. And they understood that well. I concurred. I was more than happy to sign this document, actually. And it goes on to mention God 2 more times as I counted up. But someone showed me recently a draft that's being used in history texts today. And I shook my head in dismay. They'd taken that document and reduced it to 1 reference to God. That sounds like revisionism to me, doesn't it? See, we need to stick with the real story. We need to know what actually happened so we don't fall prey, as so many others did. Well, we've now anchored at Provincetown, and the job was to set out to find a place to actually build a colony. Where are we going to put our settlement? We had several guidelines that we wish to follow. Let's get our map up. We started by making our way right down around this area, and it was right about in that area we ran into, we didn't know it at the time, but it was an Indian burial ground. It was cold. Let's see, all of this begins November 11 is when we signed the Mayflower Compact, as it's called today. And then almost immediately, a group of us went out. Miles Standish was the militia leader. By the way, don't tell Miles this, but we called him Captain Shrimp. He was 5'1", redhead. And the only difference between a redhead and a terrorist is that you can negotiate with a terrorist. So we learned early, and don't mess with Miles Standish. But at any rate, he headed up most of these. And because I had been to the New World before, folks leaned on my experience as well. So we came on this, we didn't know at the time that there was a burial mound until we started digging in. And we didn't want to be disrespectful. But we found this holding of corn. And I'd been on board the ship since July. It's now December, and we're running perilously close on food. And we're not going to be planting anything soon. And so we made the collective decision to take that corn back with the plan that we would repay those Indians when we could, when we found out who they owned it. And so don't buy this false notion that we were robbing graves here and there. It was a desperation move, and we did make good that bet, by the way. When we found out who those Indians were, we expressly and specifically paid off that debt. So having made our way down around something happened right about here. This is called the first encounter. It's coming up on the event I was just telling you about, that major storm. Just before that, we spotted some Indians, this big Grumpus-type ship. Fish, I should say. And so we went over there to investigate. They ran off, and we made camp for the night. We posted sentries, and they caught us by surprise in the morning. The arrows came flying into our little makeshift fort. The guys down at the shallop were caught off guard. Their guns were away from them. They didn't have the matches lit. But we were able to fire off several volleys. They fired several rounds of arrows. No one got hurt on either side, best I can tell. But we call that our first encounter. We wanted to be friendly, but we were fearful. We did not know what to expect. Well, we eventually made our way up through, I told you about that stormy situation. It was Clark's Island we were headed toward. Well, that's what we called it because it was Clark who helped to steer our now disabled shallop to a sandy beach. And we crashed that thing ashore. The next day, we dried out our matchlock guns, and we repaired the ship. The day after that was the Sabbath. We don't work on the Sabbath. So Monday, we continued westward from Clark's Island, and we ended up in this little place called Plymouth Bay. What we were looking for was potable water, fresh water supply, a place where there'd be some sort of a defensive mechanism. And when we walked ashore, there were several of us who probably thought at about the same time, this is it. We found what we were looking for. Oh, we have another brain teaser here of sorts. Did the Pilgrims maraud and destroy Indian burial ground? I just actually touched on that already. There was another occasion where we came on a burial ground and we backed out. We covered it back up. We did not want to be disrespectful there. We did not know about the plague that had swept through about 4 years previous, killing off so many of those folks. We saw the empty cornfields. but we didn't know the story just yet. But to answer that question, I will actually show you how the folks that I was associated with reached out and helped the Indians on various occasions. The clock is so against us. Oh, I was supposed to turn this hour gauge, and when this runs out of sand, that's when we have to stop. It takes 1 hour, so, I'm good to go. Lots of time. I'm going to have to speak quickly to get through this, but long story short is we were looking for potable water, and that was hard to find in these places. There were ponds and things like that, but not much to our liking. But when we got up here, at last we found it. It's often referred to as, we might be able to get a little audio on that too. There's that sound of water. Okay, and this was a lovely little stream that flowed through. The plan was to find a place where we'd have moving water to build a grist mill. And this grist mill was built in 1636, I think the first grist mill anywhere in the colonies. And it would grind turn 1,000, 2,000 pound stone, 1 revolution per minute to grind out this cornmeal, which then could be made into bread and whatnot. But the water also was pure. It was very drinkable because it bubbled up out of the sand. The river itself was only 1.5 miles long, and it dropped 80 feet in that 1.5 miles. But here it's placidly flowing along in between 2 hills. And the hill to the right is going to be the perfect place to set up camp. What we didn't know is the hill to the left had one time been an Indian village. We'll learn that story as we move along. So 3 things that this water would provide for us. Drinking water, of course, water power, and I'll share the next one here in just a minute. It was actually a source of food. I know, it's a cute little duck. We'll let the duckling grow up before we have it for Thanksgiving. But the other thing it provided was fish. Lots of them. Have you ever seen fish spawn? Yeah, they all swim back to where they were hatched, and they laid their eggs. And for several weeks out of the year, we did not know this because it was December. I mean, it was so cold, our fingers were freezing to death and all. Nothing like the weather we were used to in the Netherlands or England. But each spring, these waters would be teeming with fish, which translates into fertilizer because the soil there is not so good. Well, we sent the word back. We sailed back and said, we found it. And everyone voted. Do we go to Clark's Island, which has better, we're out away from the land. We don't have to travel so far to get to fishing lanes. Or do we go to the mainland where we have good defensive mechanisms? The majority voted for the latter. And so December 12, I think it is. It's been a number of years back now. But that was when the Mayflower actually sailed across the bay and anchored. What is this? I don't recognize. I recognize the slant of that hill. That's going up toward Burial Hill, but I do not recognize. Oh, yeah, First Street or Leiden Street. Okay, so that's where we actually settled. It took me a little while to process all that. Okay, that must be where Dr. Fuller. Oh, yeah. Dr. Fuller, his servant was the one that went around the ship passing out the citrus. But he hated citrus. He refused to take it himself, and he's the only person that died of all of our passengers. Now, there was one crew member who also died. He's a very obnoxious guy. And he said, I can't wait to bury one of you at sea, da-da-da-da-da. And when he died and was buried at sea, that really created a somber effect on the crew, to be sure. What else do we have here? Oh, there's John Holland. We heard about his story, how that he grabbed that rope, was miraculously saved. He was actually an indentured servant to the Carvers. Both Mr. and Mrs. Carver died that first summer. And so he was turned free. Was given their house and went on to marry and have 10 children. And what was that number? 3 million claim him as their forebearer? That's quite incredible. What about this? Those eyes, they look suspicious for sure. But there's some sort of a plaque here. Let's get a close-up of that. Oh, Pilgrim Hopkins Heritage Society. Oh, the Sea Venture. Don't bring that up. That's the ship that shipwrecked. Oh, please. Nightmare. But anyway, they're saying this is where my house was located. This looks nothing like my house. My house looked a whole lot more like this. When we came ashore, we saw this nice inclination up toward what we call Burial Hill, and that was a place where we could build our houses. We had big ambitions, but candidly, that first winter, we only got 7 built. Let's see, that's Miles Standish's house. Trying to get my bearings. Each property was 50 feet deep and 8 feet wide for each member of the family. And since there were 4 children, my wife and myself, plus the 2 servants, we got 64 feet of width. Our house is way down there. Miles Standish, I got to tell you a little bit more about him. He was quite a character at 5'1", wearing that metal armor and so forth. We tried 4 times to install him as the militia leader. And every time we tried to do it, we were interrupted in some fashion. I'll see if I can relate some of that story. But this was the common storehouse, also served as our fort, and we buried our gunpowder underneath. One time some Indians found us digging some gunpowder out, and they thought, is that the plague? Is that how you can kill off the opposition? They said, no, but we prayed to the God who does control plagues. So they were very cautious in how they answered, but they had to defend themselves. At any rate, inside that house is also where we'd meet for worship. Elder Brewster was not a pastor, but he was the one that would preach from the Geneva Bible each week to us there. Miles Standish had his set up here. And then making our way down the way here, I told you I wanted to go to the Miles Standish, his house here. Let me see if I can jump to that. A couple things. There's his sword. And then these are called clapboards. Clapboards. And the way you make these clapboards is with this special tool called a froe. I think I might have put a picture in here. In fact, I was going to have someone name the artifact, but I'm going to choose it myself because the clock is just killing me here. So let me talk to you about the froe. F-R-O-E. Do I have a picture of it up here? Well, first of all, they have to cut the wood. Lots of hardwood timber. That's good news. But it took a lot of work to saw that into lumber, which then could be turned into shingles, barrel staves, or the pieces for the sides of the wood that I told you about. So here's, for example, how this works. You take a hammer, and you just pound down on this sharp edge that splits the wood. If you're making a shingle, you use a short chunk of wood. If you're making a barrel, this would be rounded, you see? And it would make a round stave. But this is how we'd make clapboards. We take a long piece of sawed lumber and start that hammer in. We just wiggle that back and forth like this, and we could create those laths, those clapboards. And that's what we were planning to ship back to England to help pay our debt down. I'll tell you that story when we had the opportunity. So this is what those clapboards would look like as we prepare to put those on the houses. Each house had its own English garden. Onions, lettuce, herbs, different things like that. And then we had some 20 acres of corn and 6 acres of barley that first year. But I'm sort of ahead of myself. Let me tell you the story about corn. We ran out of supplies. I mean, that first winter, it was tough going. I might have some stats. I'm going to have to skip past some of this just because, again, time is getting away from us. But let me show you, if I can, this shot. Okay, this is the inside of a house. This is called waddling. That's mud mixed with twigs, and you put that on the inside, clapboard on the outside. And then right here is how we would crush the corn to make it into powder. We did not have a grist mill until 1636. Make that into powder, to the cornmeal. And then you would bake that in these ovens. Fire those up by day, and then you'd put this cornbread in and let the fire burn down through the night. And in the morning, you had this cornbread. That first winter, our supply was so short, we were down to quarter rations. Normally, this is how much each person would get one day, approximately 16 ounces. By the end of that first winter, we were down to 1/4 of that per adult per day. This is why most of the mothers didn't survive. They gave their portion to their kids. They used their bodies to keep their children warm. And the results were quite horrific, as you can imagine. But here we are. Oh, that's Winslow. Okay, Edward Winslow. Interesting. That's his brother, actually, Jonathan. This is our house, and that's my oldest daughter, Constance, that you see here. The seasoning, just a real quick run over here. These were very disheartening numbers. In November, we lost 1. In December, it was 6. In January and February, 25. By the end of March, half of our passengers and half of our crew members were dead. That seasoning process. And one might be tempted to ask God, why? Here we are trying to fulfill your mission. Did you see the compact? The Mayflower Compact was a mission statement. Our goal was to bring the gospel, especially the Separatists. I was along for the ride. But now to go through this, but you know, it's that purification process that makes one that much stronger. And those who died knew where they were going. How about that? Here's our next question. Did the Pilgrims mistreat the Indians? We answered that already, so let's just move along here. March 16. I had to tell you that story. March 16, we were getting ready to install Miles Standish as the militia leader when right down the street walks an Indian. He comes right up to the fort where we were, and he introduced himself as Samoset. He spoke English. We later learned that he had learned English from the fishermen that came to Maine, where he was from. He'd made his way down to our area, and he stayed for several hours, and we conversed, and we learned about some of the other Indians in the area. And then we were dropping hints for him to go, but he wasn't taking the hint. He just wanted beer. And so finally, they said, well, let's just put him in the Mayflower for the night, but the currents were contrary, so we couldn't do that. So they said, Hopkins, he's going to your house. So he stayed at my house all night. We did have sentries on the outside, but I'd worked with Indians before, and some people speculate, did we get any sleep that night? I did, actually, for what it's worth. But speaking of the Indians, we actually had a very amicable relation with them. They would live in these little summer huts like you see here and plant their corn and carve out their canoes and so forth. In the wintertime, they'd build more hardy structures made out of tree bark and all, inside of which would be all of these bear rugs that we had pointed out earlier. Deer hides were very commonplace as well. And that leads me to a real quick story, a scenario I wanted to share, even as time begins to elapse here. Massasoit got very, very gravely ill. And the word out was that he was not going to survive. And we'd entered into this peace treaty with him, the Wampanoag Indians, and he was head of a number of these villages. So we were very saddened to hear the account. And so we dispatched Edward Winslow to walk 50 miles. We had no horses, we had no cattle, no big livestock at that point. The first horses didn't arrive until this last decade, the 1630s. At any rate, he walked 50 miles. Halfway there, he was met by a group of Indians coming the other way, and they said, disband, go on home, he's already dead. But something within Edward Winslow said to keep going. He did. When he got there, he found the squaws had gathered inside the wigwam, the house, the longhouse where he was, and dying. And they brought in the skulls of the dead animals, and they were going all through their death chants and all. And he kicked them out, and he cleared out all those animal skulls, and he began to nurse Massasoit back to health. We're not sure if it was typhus or just what it was, but chicken broth went a long way. He was able to shoot the right fowl and to help get him nursed back to strength. So those who say that we were there rapaciously destroying and killing the Indians, that storyline tells a contrary account. And we had a fast relationship with Massasoit, right up to this day. And I have no reason to think that it couldn't continue for decades longer. So God spared Massasoit's life. In Squanto's case, he was God's instrument that first year. He had been kidnapped in 1614. He had learned English in the process, but when he got back, his whole village had been wiped out by a plague. If he had not been kidnapped, he would have been dead. He was there to say hi instead of how when we showed up. He showed us how to plant the corn with the fertilizer, the fish as fertilizer and all. Unfortunately, he died in 1622, but I'm happy to report, not before he professed Christ as his Savior. We have another time tunnel teaser here. Did the Pilgrims pay back their debt? And the answer is yes. It took a lot of work. Just a real quick story on that. How did we pay back our debt? Primarily through the sale of furs and the clapboard that you heard me talk about, along with a few other sassafras. Anyone like sassafras tea? The English love sassafras tree, and there were a lot of sassafras trees there. It also makes a nice smoking wood for meat. At any rate, this is a beaver fur. Would anyone like to venture a guess how much corn it would take to purchase one beaver pelt? We've got Indian corn here. How much corn would it take? A basket this size? Would it take a basket this size or less or more to trade for one beaver skin? Any thoughts? Right down in the front. Yes. Give me an idea. Do you think it would take a full basket of corn to get one of these? Okay. It actually takes 3.5 to get one. Think of the effort it takes. You have to pick 3.5 bushels of corn to get one pelt. It was basically, a pelt weighs about 3 pounds. The ones up in Maine are bigger than the ones in our area. And this pelt basically sells for 1 pound sterling for every pound of weight. So we had collected a couple barrels worth, hog's head they're called, and we shipped that back on the first ship that showed up, the Fortune. It was not very fortunate. As the ship came within land, they thought it was the Land's End of England, so they turned south, and they actually were passing Brittany. They sailed right into the Bay of Biscay. The French captured them. They took all of the furs, about 500 pounds sterling's worth. They interrogated the crew, made them sign a paper that they took everything of value, and then they released them. Another time we sent a ship through, and that time the Muslims got a hold of them. Not only did they take all of the cargo, they enslaved the captain and crew and stole the ship. So I guess you prefer the French. I see, are you French? You have those sans culottes on. Are you French? Oh, I'm just curious. Okay. Grazie. In Italian. All right, so we need to hasten on. First Thanksgiving. What's the story about the first Thanksgiving? Did we do it to praise the Indians? I heard someone tell me that's the storyline that some are promulgating today. Let me tell you, that first summer, the Lord blessed. Now, after March, we only had 2 people die, and that was Mr. Carver, the governor, and his wife. He died of a heat stroke. We're not sure what caused her death a month later or so. But things were looking good. We had our private gardens. We had the collective land. That was not working so well. There were some that were not pulling their fair share, and within 2 years, we're going to do away with that by 1623, go private, which was a good movement. But the first Thanksgiving, it's typical at the end of the harvest season to thank the Lord for his blessings. And so we sent some out to catch some waterfowl. Some others went out to shoot some wild turkeys. We invited Massasoit and the Indians, and 90 of them showed up with 5 deer. So you would have deer like this. Of course, they use the pelts, and then the meat can be turned into venison and so forth. And we celebrated for 3 days. We played games. We had a great time. And so that first Thanksgiving was designed to thank God for his provision, for his wonderful blessing that year. Someone showed these images to me. I'm going to run through them as our time quickly elapses. I still have plenty of sand in the hourglass, but I know our time is getting close here. And I'm just going to give some commentary based on what I see. I call this Monument Mile. So let's just roll these images. First, we have the Pilgrim Maiden. There were 14 on board, as I remember. Most of them, several were orphans. 13 or so was the average age. There were a few that were of marriageable age, and they did eventually get married. Those that survived, the first summer, I should say. And so this statue honors the Pilgrim, the single ladies. Here's the Pilgrim Mother. So we have the Pilgrim Maiden, now the Pilgrim Mother. 18 mothers got on board the Mayflower. 14 died that first year. So just 4 survived. In fact, I think there were just 7 people who went through that whole first winter without getting ill. Only 3 families got through unscathed. We were fortunate to lose just 2 children that first winter. But these women gave their all. I told you about the quarter portions given each day and how they gave for their own kids. I'll tell you what, these mothers reared sturdy families. They were the ones in charge of the household. They worked with the girls that were there and did a wonderful job, and I can only give the highest of praise. My first wife, Mary, had passed, and so it's Elizabeth that was with me, and by the Lord's grace, she survived that first year and is still alive to this day. As we continue down Monument Mile, this is in Plymouth, Massachusetts. There it is up on the hill. That's Massasoit. I was telling you a little bit about him. He was a very powerful, influential Indian in the area, and we formed a fast relationship. It was a very amicable one. Now, as I look at that imagery, that land has filled in underneath. I mean, the water came right up to the base of that hill when I was there. It looks like they've added 500 feet of land to that. I'm not sure exactly what that was about. But here we have, William Bradford. We would be remiss if we closed our proceedings without talking a little bit about him. After Carver died, William Bradford was elected governor, and he would serve in that station for the next number of years running. I actually served as his assistant for a time. I had my share of government and was happy to be done with that. But he was the one that was out with us when we were investigating, exploring that first round there in early December, and got back to the news that his wife had slipped on the icy surface of the Mayflower and had drowned. He never said much about it in his writings. I do have a copy of his writing here, which is a hearty recommended read for you, and that's of Plymouth Plantation. And he just shares a first-hand account, but he says precious little about his wife's passing there. The grief he just carried quietly through the years. Oh, what was that? Oh, that's a monument. Let's see. Of the 104 passengers, these died in Plymouth during the first year. 104. Oh, there were 102 of us, but there were actually 2 born en route. I did not tell you that my wife gave birth to a baby on board ship. We named him Oceanus since he was born en route. Happily, he did not survive that first year. There was another one that was born as well, and so that's 104. And I guess years later, I was told water came down and washed out these grave sites, so they put them all in one location, put all the bones there. And so as I read through that roster of names, boy, my mind is flashing back to all of these individuals, how they contributed, the suffering they went through, how they prevailed through thick and thin, and their reward, of course, is in the next world, isn't it? Well, we have one more stop here as we finish out this monument sequence, and this is the Plymouth Mystery that we need to address. And that has to do with a monument, I was told, that was constructed, and I've been asked to comment as to the veracity, the accuracy of this map. Is this just 19th century Christian historians trying to superimpose Christianity, or is this an accurate portrayal of what the Pilgrims really represented? It's a structure with a 36-foot high carving on top of a 50-some foot high pedestal. So it's a total of 81 feet high, made out of granite. And she's got her right hand pointed upward, and her left hand is holding a Bible. That's right. That was the emphasis there of Plymouth Plantation through and through. The Bible is center place. If you read Pastor Robinson's letter, he admonished us to follow the Scriptures and not to hold grudges and not to insult others, but rather to live godly lives. And so it's altogether appropriate that they would show that. I'm getting dizzy here. Oh, that's an aerial shot. We're looking down on top of her. I wonder what those statuary are about around the base. So this is a monument to the forefathers, national monument. I recognize that. Oh, there's Faith. Plymouth Rock. Was there such a thing as Plymouth Rock? There's different stories about that. I'm not going to have the time to address it tonight, except to say that when we stepped on shore there in December of 1620, we were happy to be on shore. I'd been on board that ship since July. People ask, how long were the Pilgrims traveling? Was it 66 days? Well, actually, some of us were on board that ship for 9 months. We were glad to be on there there's morality. Look at that. In other words, the Pilgrims emphasized the role that morality must play for any free society to prevail. I'm told that there were actually little statuary on the side. Prophet on the one side, evangelist on the other. See, the prophet is God's word to man. The evangelist is man's being offered a hope from God. Here comes law. How about that? Suppressing tyranny, suppressing that. And really, freedom and religion were the two axes about which our whole proposition revolved here. What do we have coming up next? Education. Oh, yes. Big emphasis. We homeschooled. We didn't have any formal schools there, but the book opened, and the young mind is being introduced to ideas. And then here comes liberty. Aha. That's the lion's paw. There's the rest of that lion. And so he is, with the sword, conquered. Of course, there is a little subtle image there, the British using the lion as their symbol. And so I would say it was altogether accurate. And then as we close things out, this is a carving on the one side of that monument. And I'm going to read that to you. Thus out of small beginnings, greater things have been produced by his hand that made all things of nothing and gives being to all things that are. And as one small candle may light 1,000, so the light here kindled hath shone unto many, yea, in some sort to our whole nation. Let the glorious name of Jehovah have all praise. I couldn't think of a more apt way to capture the essence. That was right out of Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. As one small candle has been lit, that perhaps would then be the beginning of a nation, it seems he is saying here. And so our closing remark and challenge would be, why curse the darkness when you can light a candle? Father, we thank you we've had this opportunity to examine these issues and to consider from a Christian perspective truth. And we know that you are the guardian of truth, and I pray that each of us would have a deeper appreciation as a result of some of the remarks shared this evening. And in this 400-year anniversary, as we approach Thanksgiving, we're going to hear contrary tales and accounts. Help us to go back to the sources and purpose not to swerve to the right or to the left. May you be the one that's glorified as you continue to build each of us up for more effective service. We ask that you dismiss us now with your love, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Good night. You are dismissed. Thank you very much.